When we talk about risk assessment for violence and atrocities, we look at factors such as governance, conflict history, economic conditions, and social fragmentation. In the US, these risk factors are very real. We have a declining democracy across all indices, a deep history of genocide of indigenous peoples and the atrocities of enslavement, wide economic disparities, and increasing fragmentation in society driven by identity politics in which some groups deny the civil and human rights of others and are emboldened to call for and engage in acts of violence. Climate change is now recognized as a risk factor for atrocities, and this talk is really important because it explores the links among white supremacy, climate change, ecofascism, and hopeful educational projects rooted in indigenous pedagogies. And I don't consider environmental ed to be a subject. I think we all need to infuse this into our teaching. So I really appreciate this talk. One note, this lecture is being streamed through Zoom and recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel. Please use the Q&A section of Zoom and I'll moderate the Q&A after the talk. Thank you very much. It's now my honor to introduce our speakers. Dr. Joseph Henderson is an associate professor of social sciences in the Department of Environment and Society at Paul Smith's College of the Adirondacks. He is trained as an anthropologist of environmental and science education, and his research investigates how sociocultural, political, and geographic factors influence teaching and learning about climate change. He completed a PhD at the University of Rochester, where he conducted ethnographic analyses of scientific learning, sustainability education, and educational policy. His postdoctoral work at the University of Delaware examined the emerging field of climate change education from a learning sciences and educational policy perspective. His current research investigates how environmental education contributes to emerging eco-fascist movements around the world. He recently co-edited Teaching Climate Change in the United States, a collection that celebrated the diversity of climate change education programs across the United States. He has published in the Journal of Environmental Education, Environmental Education Research, the International Journal of Science Education, and Educational Studies. He is an associate editor at the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences and the Adirondack Journal of Environmental Studies. He's on the board of the Adirondack Research Consortium. He lives in Saranac Lake, New York, with his wife Tracy and their 2 children, and where he's a member of the Saranac Lake Central School District's Board of Education. In his free time, he likes to hike mountains, backcountry ski, and play video games. Stephanie Morningstar is a Ghanaian Mohawk with ancestors rooted in, I apologize for butchering that, with ancestors rooted in 6 nations of the Grand River Territory and Europe. She is a plant nerd, medicine tender, bridge builder, soil and seed steward, scholar, student, and earth worker, dedicated to embodying her decolonial values through the practice of biocultural restoration. She regenerates soil, reintegrates mycelium, and restores and restories ecosystems at Skyworld Apothecarian Farm, teaches about the connection between land, plants, humans, culture, and kin through a decolonial lens at Seed, Soil, and Spirit School, and is the co-founder in Relationships and Reciprocity, co-director at the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, where she collaborates with comrades, ancestors, and allies to liberate land and redistribute land-based wealth with and for Indigenous, Black, and people of color. Stephanie's work in her PhD program at SUNY ESF Center for Native Peoples and the Environment is focused on biocultural restoration in Ganye, Genha, and Haudenosaunee territory. And now I'm very excited to present the Ganders Lecture on Grasping at the Roots of Ecofascism, a conversation on climate change, white supremacy, and the need for radical education projects.
You guys hear me in the back, okay? All right, cool. I got a lot of things going on here, so I will be looking up there, which is mostly my slides, so sorry for that. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. As you were talking, I was like, wow, that was a lot of writing. So much writing. I guess kind of this is what I was thinking, what we were thinking for some time today. So I'm going to do a kind of big overview. We're going to have some kind of constructive response and conversation, and then we'll open it up to you all. We're very interested in engaging in this topic with you all as well. Some of this stuff is hard to talk about, so just heads up that that's coming as well.
And just a heads up that, like you mentioned, this is going to be a heavy kind of listening moment for everybody. And we're not going to leave you hanging. So we're going to be learning together and unlearning together, but we're also going to be processing some of that grief together, just to make sure that you have some tools to be able to do that before you walk out the store today.
Thank you for that. I put a picture of a chipmunk up there because where I live, they're very busy right now getting ready for winter. And so also I'm from Chipmunk, New York, and I'll say a little bit about that. Yes, that's a place. So just generally, thank you all for being here with us. We used oh, is that good? Cool. Okay. The title of the talk uses the word roots and radicals, and I wanted to just think about the term radical and its etymology, where it comes from. It's the Latin word radix, roots in the ground, kind of thoroughgoing or extreme. So you will hear us talk a lot about the roots of things and the growth of things and how things might grow otherwise. So I think we're going to talk about plants and plant metaphors in a lot of ways. I'm a big fan of oops, not going. Good? Okay, cool. Let me try that again. Okay. So I'm a big fan of this guy, Wendell Berry, agrarian poet. Some of you may know of him. And I just love this quote from him. And as I was thinking about what does it mean to be radical, this one, right? How do we submit? Why do we let people piss in our cistern, as he says, right? We submit by not being radical enough or by not being thorough enough, which is the same thing. When I talk about climate change education, you'll see why I picked this. So some roots, right? Let's just talk about kind of where we are, right? Julia mentioned the history of this land. I grew up where that little star is in a teeny town called Chipmunk, New York, right next to the Seneca Reservation, Seneca. I now am in the Adirondacks, Mohawk land, work with the St. Regis Mohawk tribes at my school. So, by the way, this is from Native Land website, excellent website if you want to know that history. That's Chipmunk, New York. That's the Allegheny Seneca Reservation, just to orient yourself, Cattaraugus County. That star is where my house was. It is in a bedrock region that has a lot of carbon in it, and there's a lot of oil drilling in that area. So historically, turn of the century, it was a boom town. There was a railroad in Chipmunk, New York. The legacy of that stuff is still there. That's a pump jack across the street from my house, picture my sister took. There's a lot of remnants of old oil tanks up in the woods. As a kid, I would throw rocks into the thick black tar stuff. I joke when I teach my environmental studies class, I say, this stuff is literally in my blood. As somebody who grew up poor, white, in a rural area, I was subjected to a good amount of pollution. What that's going to do to me as I get older, I think about all the time. This is my work now. So I teach at Paul Smith College. It's beautiful. We're a very small, mostly environmentally oriented school in the Adirondacks, outside of Saranac Lake. I am trained as an anthropologist of environmental education. I have this weird interdisciplinary background. Most of my work is on climate change education. My school is very small. We're about 60% male. We're a predominantly white institution. Many of my students come from rural backgrounds. Majority of our students are first-generation college students. I have the privilege of teaching them a lot of issues of environmental justice and social justice, and I think very carefully about that. So climate change, right? I'm not going to get into a ton on climate change, but I just want us to think about the story of climate change. We often are told this story like humans are burning carbon, and then it's going into the air, and then it works like a blanket and keeps us warm, right? How many people have ever heard that story? Right? If you've had a climate change education, like that's traditionally the story you get, right? But there's a lot left out of that conversation, which is which humans, why? Which humans are burning the carbon? Where is it going? Where is it coming from? There's a whole lot of social dimensions of climate change that in many science classes goes unstated, right? So we have this, right? Carbon cycle is being disrupted by humans. Many people have probably seen this. This is famous CO2 data from Scripps Oceanographic in La Jolla, California. CO2 levels over 400 parts per million for the rest of your lives, continuing to go up in that kind of pattern, right? It produces temperature anomalies, the Earth is getting warmer. Right, there's all sorts of climate scientists who are studying this. And what I want to say here, and the way a social scientist thinks about this, is climate change is colonialism. It is some countries burning carbon and building wealth off the backs of other countries. And that process continues now. Feel free to leave the little one in the back, by the way. No worries.
Oh, thank you.
It's all good. I have 2 little ones in myself, so it's not going to bother us at all. Climate change is colonialism, right? You have developed countries in the kind of global north, first world, if you want to use that kind of older language, who have become developed and have developed their energy systems primarily by extracting and expropriating labor and resources from other countries around the world. That process is still going on. Right? When you're talking about who uses the most carbon, this is something called the wine glass graph, right? The top richest 10% of people in the world, predominantly white, use something like 50% of all carbon. Also, from a justice perspective, the least likely currently to be impacted by climate change, although that is changing in the United States, which is part of the reason why we're talking about it. All of this is about the kind of racist control of quote unquote resources and people. I put that in quotes for reasons I'll get into later. Those are piles of buffalo skulls, attack on the kind of Buffalo Nation. That's Kinzu Dam, which is the damming of a river near I grew up, which flooded about a bunch of Seneca homesteads, right? It's also, and crucially for somebody who grew up rural poor, it's the colonization of rural areas as well, right? So you have timber extraction in the Adirondacks, oil extraction in, where I grew up as well. One thing to say about this, right? This is all kind of baked into the cake of the very idea of what we call America. It is foundational to this country. So if you've never seen this before, this is a painting called American Progress by John Gast. And what you see there is kind of westward expansion deemed by God to kind of have progress and heading west. So if you look at this, just the orientation, right? You have Columbia carrying the book of knowledge, kind of moving in an angelic way towards the dark, kind of savage, dangerous area, right? And she's bringing with her power lines and agriculture and railroads, crucially, for kind of westward expansion, right? So that's the kind of some of the roots, right? Here are some of the shoots. Here are things that are growing. We're starting to see this process around the world of democratic backsliding, nationalism, autocratization, as the political scientists would call. So this is a recent survey of kind of places in the world where you're starting to see the rise of autocracies, including here in the United States. We should talk about whether the US has ever actually been democratic. It's a whole nother conversation, but we're starting to see people who study national security, counterterrorism. I can tell you the FBI now sees white domestic violence as the dominant threat in the United States. Those kinds of incidences are on the rise. What we're seeing as well, again, in this country, and then also in other countries, specifically European countries, but not just European countries, is the rise of fascism. Fascism emerges for a bunch of reasons that we can get into in the Q&A, but I really like Robert Paxton's work on this, and so I put a kind of his definition of fascism, right? A mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence. That's an interesting thing to think about. You want to make things great again. Put it another way, make Italy great again. Ecofascism is a particular variant of this, and one thing to say is like fascist movements have always had an environmental edge. Without getting into the history of Nazi Germany, we'll talk a little bit about that, but environmentalisms are many, and there is no singular environmentalism. There are what are called right-wing environmentalisms, which is what we're going to talk about now. So essentially the appropriation of nature for political, for reactionary reasons. It's often a political project that connects national purity with racial or ethnic gender purity. usually a romanticized, pristine, natural environment. You're going to get into some of the myths and narratives around that. So one thing to say is that this is ethno-nationalist and authoritarian. So we see this cropping up at farmers markets here in the United States around organic food movements. A lot of the QAnon stuff comes out of wellness influencers and like yoga culture and things like that, which is fascinating to think about. That gentleman there, the Q shaman, who was making his way through the US Capitol on the race riot at January 6th. That's he has Norse mythology. And when he was arrested, I saw a lot of people mocking his request for organic food. And that wasn't surprising to me at all. There's roots in American conservation movements and American environmentalism, specifically around eugenics. This is a kind of early eugenics visualization from the progressive movements in the early 1900s, and the kind of this notion that you can perfect human nature is the thing that I would say about eugenics. That's Madison Grant. Madison Grant is the kind of godfather of wildlife management, creation of a lot of zoos, influential to American politicians at the time. He had a book called The Passing of the Great Race, very much kind of white supremacist. Anti-immigrant, anti-miscegenation, long history in kind of environmental. All of this we refer to as kind of right-wing ecologisms, and there's different kinds of ways that these things are taken up politically. But essentially, you have the mixing of racial ideology and environmentalism, and environmentalism is used in the service of racial ideology. So all of those different obsessions, things that I was just talking about, but concerns of overpopulation, population control, invasives, like what's an invasive, who is an invasive, treatment of immigrants as vermin, you've probably heard this kind of language, shithole countries, if you want to quote prior politicians, controlling land, things like that. That guy on the left there is Garrett Hardin, Tragedy of the Commons, white supremacists. The guy in the middle there is John Weir, had a lot of pretty bigoted views towards immigrants, specifically Chinese immigrants. Instrumental in the creation of national parks, which are kind of a whole lot of people were kicked out to make that land. So that image on the right is an image from a shooter manifesto, and I'm not going to tell you which one it's from, but some of the incidents of mass violence that we've seen the last couple of years, that's a neo-Nazi, actually it's a Nazi black sun that comes out of Nazi Germany. This was the cover of one of the shooter manifestos. And when you look at that, there's a lot of stuff going on in these documents. They're deeply confused documents. We can talk about them if you want, but environmentalism is one of the planks, right, of these kinds of ideologies. So the Buffalo, New York shooter that we will talk about had a kind of environmental ethic, and often it's a belief that like it's a fascist response to climate change, right? Like we need to be in control, not those people. And the point I would make about this is that this is nothing new. If you think about blood and soil ideology, these guys marching through the street of Charlottesville, Virginia, were chanting blood and soil. It's deeply rooted in kind of Nazi ideology, neo-Nazi ideology. Ecofascism and these kinds of responses are just more of the same. It's more of the same white supremacy. It's more of the same settler colonialism. It's more of the same racist control of land and people. And why it's reemerging, I think, is interesting. We can get into some of that too. But in my field of environmental education, these are the kinds of things that I think about. And this is what I'm writing about and what I'm publishing on right now. There are things that are pretty common in a lot of environmental ed and climate change education. Things like apocalyptic kind of doomer narratives, right? And the research shows that when you actually pummel people with doomer narratives, they become authoritarian because they want a kind of strong daddy to make things make sense of them. Yes, I said strong daddy. My students do the same thing when I say that. They want order, right? If you live in a world that's like increasingly chaotic, you want someone to make order, right? Eugenics, the kind of ideas that some people are genetically superior, race science, right, which has no Race has no biological basis, social construction. Get into one. Population control, control of land and resources. When I talk to my students and I'll say like, what are the biggest environmental issues facing like you? They'll say population. And I'm like, okay, well then what do you do about that? And they're not thinking like condoms. They're thinking like some people shouldn't be reproducing. Purity logics. This one is really interesting to me, the kind of mystification of nature as sacred, humans as impure, viruses. So this is where some of the organic food culture, ritual purifications, bodily purification rituals, anti-vax sentiment, right, plays into some of this, wellness diets. A lot of the QAnon stuff is coming out of those cultures. And then just the general kind of fetishization of natural cultures. So like Norse mythology, which I know you're going to get into. This kind of performing a desire to return to a prior state where humans were kind of like not fallen or more sacred. Masculinity gets tied up with this as well in interesting ways, which I don't really have time to get into. But I'm an education researcher, and there are educational scholars who are starting to think about this, and those are some of the books that I have found helpful over the years. I'm also an anthropologist. Scott Atran's work with the communities of practice of terrorists. How is it that mostly young men become recruited and then turn violent? He has found it has to do with kind of dislocations of globalization and things like that. John Walensky, this book is classic. I kind of wish I'd read it in my doctoral work, actually. Learning to Divide the World. It's about the kind of colonial thinking and how it shapes everything from zoos to science curriculum. So if anybody's in educational studies, highly recommend this book. More recently, Cynthia Miller-Idris is a sociologist of education. She's at American University, where she leads a whole research group on interrupting online radicalization, specifically the kind of meme dimensions of it, the mimetic dimensions of it, which we were just talking about. So that's a more recent book if you want to see some of that. The question then, I think, becomes, okay, what do we do now, right? Given this history, can we actually create something new? And this is where some of the literature on indigenous epistemologies, post-colonial thinking, anti-racism, a lot of this stuff is starting to kind of remind us that there are other ways of living. And so like, how do you actually create something new? So in my own work, and this is kind of where I'll end and then turn it over. I just published a piece with a couple of colleagues called "What is Climate Change Education in Trump Country?" where we're trying to think about like, what is the justice movement? We talk a lot about educational justice, social justice, right? What is the justice project for mostly poor rural white people? Because you got to start to think about that, about what are the implications of those things. So we get into that in terms of how we do it in our own classrooms. And a lot of it is around teaching about things like colonialism and resource extraction and inequality and stuff like that. On our own campus, we're having some really interesting spaces of solidarity with indigenous communities. Interestingly, we have a lot of veterans on our campus, and they are really interesting because they understand something about America that a lot of people don't necessarily get to see. And so those kinds of spaces around imperialism and colonialism and creating really spaces on campus where people can have those kinds of conversations. Olufemi Taiwo, I'm a big fan of his work. He talks a lot about climate reparations, but also identity politics. And I think his point that we should do constructive politics, that we need to make it possible to like come together to build something different and to build something better together, even though that gets uncomfortable at times. So I'm actually deeply grateful that we're all able to be here thinking about this stuff together. In terms of climate change education, these are the things that we are working on within my field of climate change education, centering climate justice approaches that get at issues of power and equality, right? Climate, like understanding, here's a point I would make. Ecofascists deeply understand climate science. They just take it to really disturbing places. And so like when you have earth scientists who are like, we just need to teach people about climate change. I'm like, you really should think that through. Like, you really got to process the implications of that, right? This is why you have to have social scientists, like talking to natural scientists. So climate climate change, you have to look at the root causes: domination of nature, racial capitalism, those kind of extractivist things I was talking about earlier, colonialism. And that's really generative spaces when you start to have those kinds of conversations. One of the things that I think we really need to think about is de-radicalization pathways, alternative pathways for people who are culturally susceptible to these kind of fascism. That's right. The internet is an interesting place to think about in terms of how does radicalization happen, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you want to talk about that. But so that's my part. I'm going to turn it over. I like to leave with this meme. I really like this meme. I'm going to change the world. And she's like, for the better, right? 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 Thank you.
So, can everybody hear me okay? All right, stay close, everybody. I'm Stephanie Morningstar. I am Yanagi Haga, which is a Mohawk Turtle Clan.
I practiced that so many
I
times.
really appreciate it, Julia. I want to thank the SU School for Education, Atrocity Studies and Humanities program, Julia, for putting this together today. It's been so great. And Joe, the collaboration has been really wonderful and generative, and I feel like it's the beginning of a long friendship. So and all of you for showing up. I know some of you are here because it's your class, but I hope that you can get something out of this. And this is a subject that's actually something I don't talk about a lot, but have a lot to say about. So appreciate the opportunity. So just a quick trigger warning for folks who are here. If you're coming to a lecture on ecofascism, that's not enough of a trigger warning for you. I don't know what is, but I just want to explicitly name here that there will be discussion and descriptions in the content of my talk that reference racialized violence, genocide, and enslavement. I've tried my best to limit this content to brief contextual descriptions, and I invite you to take care of yourself in the ways that you need to, as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. So let's just take a moment to take a deep and rich breath together and check in with our ancestors and our own modes of self-care before I start. I'm going to do that right now to model it. All right. Can I use that?
Yeah.
So the first thing I do when I start presenting is I do not do a land acknowledgement. I practice a land atonement. And I learned this from Rick Hill, who's a colleague and a mentor of mine for the past 30 years. He's a Tuscarora Beaver from Six Nations, and shared this with me, and I kind of adapted it. So we acknowledge that we have failed to uphold our responsibility to the land. Sorry, it always gets me emotional. Because of our collective conduct, the air is often unbreathable, the waters have become polluted, a large amount of animal, plant, and bird species have disappeared, the soil has been depleted and filled with toxins. Your body has been divided and claimed as property, enslaved in the name of power and control. Climate change brought on by the capitalist extraction and greed is on the verge of destroying life on Earth. For Mother, the Earth, we apologize and commit to returning the land to those who can care better for it. I am trying my hardest and best to the best of my ability to do my part, including reshaping the systems that control, as well as healing the earth and all who make life on Earth so that we may provide a home liberated from this grief one day. So picture this. Picture this. I'm sitting with my husband in a darkened theater, and the roaring soundtrack of a Marvel superhero movie permeates the air. On the screen, Avengers Infinity Wars is culminating with a battle between Thanos, a hulking purple supervillain, and Thor, a flaxen hair legendary superhero. Thanos holds up a glowing yellow gem, regarding it and savoring the power of this moment. He's finally completed his quest of acquiring the 6 Infinity Stones, the elemental crystals that control the essential aspects of the universe. Maybe had some daddy issues as well. He places the gem onto the Infinity Gauntlet, a magical metallic glove designed to channel the power of all 6 Infinity Stones, snapping it into place like a rare earth magnet. The surge of power runs up his hulkish purple arm, jolting into his body, instilling him with the super strength of all of the elements of the universe. Battle for good versus evil ensues between Thor and Thanos, ending with that famous snap. The moment when he snapped his infinity gauntleted fingers, resulting in the immediate genocide of 50% of the human race. Thanos, whose name is derived from the Greek Thanatos, is the personification of death and oblivion. His character believed that the only way to save the universe was to depopulate it, thereby eliminating the conflict for resources that would lead to death and suffering. And with that snap, he was canonized as the patron saint of ecofascism. I remember trying on that feeling, the imagined pressure of too many people, of the fear that starvation and ecological destruction wage in our imaginaries. I remember feeling complicit, knowing that ecological destruction that we're currently enduring is our own fault, that it's human created, but it felt unfinished, that feeling. Too simple, too easy to just relegate us to the annals of history as nothing but destructive, a virus, a cancer, a swarm of pestilence that the earth would be better off without. The days, months, and even years after seeing this scene left me interrogating my own complicity and contrasting that with my positionality as an Indigenous woman who comes from a completely different worldview, one where humans aren't inherently harmful, but are instead the newest kids on the block with a very specific set of instructions that have been bestowed upon us with the responsibility for caring for the rest of creation, of which we are just a young part. I also come from Buffalo. Those are my roots. And I actually spent a lot of time right down where Joe used to live and grew up in Seneca territory in Ohio. And I remember walking one day with my nieces, my 11-year-old nieces on May 14th, and we were preparing for the upcoming Women's March in response to the mounting tensions around the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Justice was already on our minds. And while walking between the shops in the town of East Aurora looking for science supplies, I started getting pings to my phone about a shooting in Buffalo, only 20 minutes away. Buffalo and the east side of Buffalo is where my family lived after moving from Six Nations in the late 1940s and remained their home until my grandmother passed away in the late 80s. I have found memories of sitting in front of their house on Sherman Street, making potions with the plants I found around me in the cracks of the sidewalks and vacant lots, and going to the grocery store with my grandmother, a grocery store that disappeared not long after they moved away. The east side is rich with history and community, but it's also the epicenter of food apartheid in the city. As the news came rolling in about the massacre at the grocery store, at the only grocery store left on the east side at that point, the names of the 10 beloved dead rang in my mind, heart, and spirit. The families, loved ones, most of whom were merely shopping while Black, out getting birthday cakes and supplies for dinner on an average spring day, now had to grapple with the void in their lives left by a black hole of hate and fear. As the community surrounded these families and each other with support and collective healing, the motives of the young man who murdered these people and planned to continue on throughout the city became clear. He identified as a, quote, American neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, eco-fascist, ethno-nationalist, populist, and white supremacist. Following the examples of other eco-fascists, his goal was to, quote, to terrorize all non-white, non-Christian people and to get them to leave this country. The most frightening part of this, outside of the sheer terror and wake of grief and loss that reverberated through the hearts of Buffalo, was that the 180-page manifesto he wrote was 57% plagiarized. And that he was radicalized virtually, blindly believing the myths that incited enough fear and loathing for him to move from words into violent action. I haven't named any of the people who wage mass murder here, nor will I. Invoking their names feels sacrilegious in this moment, but I will honor the beloved dead. Aaron Salter, who was a former police lieutenant and was working as a security guard who confronted the shooter, and also Celestine Cheney, Roberta Drury, Andre McNeil, Catherine Massey, Magnus Morrison, Hayward Pattison, Geraldine Talley, Ruth Whitfield, and Pearl Young. Just take a moment So we can't discuss fascism without briefly addressing some of the roots, as you mentioned, Joe, and the construction of capitalism and race. We're not going to go deep into this because this is a whole course that we're basically teaching in an hour and a half, but so we're just going to touch on some things. The history of colonization on Turtle Island is an intersecting story about the control of land, humans, and non-human beings who have been reduced to resources through a violent blitz of theft, abduction, dehumanization, and extraction, resulting in the deterioration of the environment, leading to our current state of social inequity, environmental degradation, and climate crisis. This history is not a natural phenomenon. Food deserts do not exist. It is directly linked to extractor-settler colonialism, which is a, quote, historical condition remade at particular moments of conflict in the service of securing certain privileges, which continues to devour in the name of wealth and power. These processes are deeply interconnected and interdependent. The removal of humans through violence, forced displacement and enslavement, the collapse of lifeways, food apartheid, biological violence, erasure of language, history, and culture on the land and in our minds and spirits, and mass extinction, all for economic gain, as well as geographic and political power. In order for the settler, colonial, and capitalist project to continue its path of domination and accumulation, methods of control and categorization came into the form of racism and colorism, ensuring that Indigenous peoples' identities were brought out of existence due to blood quantum laws, leaving our lands to be stolen, and that made Black folks Black, discounting their indigeneity, and enslaved, indentured, and disenfranchised them through racist US policies like the Black Codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, and the war on drugs. The only legal human beings left were initially Eurocentric in origin, superimposing Eurocentric governance, values, and philosophy with a new racial twist to ensure land and capital that land can produce was kept in the new social location of whiteness. So that's our ecofascism OG. And hey, ecofascism is not new. I think people just now, because it's becoming so much more prevalent in the media, are not really thinking about where the roots actually started. And as Joe mentioned, these are some. These are some old pictures. So these are the founding fathers of things like the environmental conservation movement, who created national parks and kicked all of my people off our land in order to be able to create pristine, the myth of the pristine, right? It's about division and separation of humans from nature, which I don't know if I get into here a lot, but just thinking about the Enlightenment and how the Enlightenment shifted our perceptions of who we are in relation to nature. So environmentalism and climate politics are not intrinsically issues central to progressive liberal politics, as many of us think they are. Eco-fascist movements, progenitors Ernest Haeckel, Madison Grant, Malthus, Sanborn, Osborne, built a nationalist foundation that weaponized biology, anthropology, environmentalism, leading to a human-centric fascist ideology. And in fact, ecology has been long been a genuine concern for far-right groups and conservative nationalists, which you had mentioned. Ernest Haeckel, who coined the term ecology in 1866, is one of those people, and questions around what belongs in nature, who it should be protected for, and who it should be protected from, as well as its importance to the spiritual and racial health of the people, harkening back to those Nazi chants of blood and soil, was a major preoccupation and incantation for fascist thinkers across Europe, and still continues today. On Turtle Island, Madison Grant continued the experiment. He's a lawyer, anthropologist, writer, and zoologist, really interesting interdisciplinary admixture that was better known for how he warped those facets of his life into a dangerous proto-eco-fascist legacy that blended eugenics, scientific racism, and conservation. On one hand, Grant founded things like the first organizations dedicated to protecting the redwoods and the American buffalo. And on the other, let's say, infinity gauntleted hand, he displayed kidnapped tribal members in zoos, published works warning of the decline of the Nordic race, and often espoused that he and his colleagues bore the responsibility of saying what forms of life shall be preserved. Anders Breivik, the person who massacred 77 people at a Norwegian youth camp in 2011, drew direct inspiration from his legacy of racial hierarchy and dehumanization. His synthesis of white supremacy combined with environmental conservation fueled the imaginaries of generations of Eurocentric misanthropes whose minds have been made crooked by generations of colonization, imperialization, and westernization. So one of the ways that we make minds crooked, or minds can become made crooked, are through myths that we have blind belief in. So we're going to talk about some of these myths, and then we're going to move into just a brief talk about what I'm doing in my work to address these things, but also I'm going to bring you through a process just to sort of get some of this out, because it's not a great feeling to hold. So these are some of the myths that we're dealing with, right? Overpopulation is environmental crisis. Humans are greedy locusts who can't stop consuming. Humans are a virus. Urban populations are the problem. That there are immigrants swarming the borders, and that environmental and social collapse is the only answer. That we have to do a reset. We need a reset button. So I'm going to help you address these myths. And what I'll say is that we're all going to be sitting around a dinner table soon, in about a little over a month, most of us. And this is where these conversations come up. With uncomfortable Uncle Joe, who is always a little bit boundary aggressive, and or whoever it might be, there's always somebody that is going to bring this up, just like it's a normal, natural, everyday occurrence. We need to be prepared for these moments, because these are the people who are fueling eco-fascist ideology. And they're also not just fueling it at the dinner table, they're fueling it online in echo chambers. So we need to have a little bit of a counter narrative to that. And I'm going to just briefly touch on this before we get into some of the good stuff. So overpopulation. Overpopulation leads to environmental pressures. Genocide is the only way to stop climate change. That's not true. It's hard to see my slides, but the climate crisis is caused by 10% of the world's wealthiest people, right? This is all about capitalism. It's all about extraction and power. These are the businesses these businesses emit 50% of the greenhouse gases that are harming the environment. And the poorest 50% emit less than 7%. And a lot of it is about environmental siting decisions and moving to the countries where the environmental regulations are just lessened because they're still quote unquote. So to actually fight environmental destruction, we need to fight against inequalities and for political and economic systems that prioritize human dignity and environmental regeneration. Humans are greedy. We're locusts. We're the primary driver of climate change. That's not true. We actually have forgotten who we are. It's not so long ago that we actually did have original instructions that we upheld. And it's only been, as you can see from the climate data, it's not like this has been a progressive over thousands of years climb. This is very, very, very recently. So the belief that this is a distraction tactic, this one. It's the belief that we need to acknowledge systemic inequality and that's leaving a wake of destruction, that it's not that humans are inherently horrible. We're not. Every one of us was born as a baby, right? Like we don't mean anybody any harm. And it's how we are brought up and what ideology, what philosophy we are brought up in. And if we are continuing the cycle of abuse that our ancestors have experienced over multiple generations, you kind of forget that it's actually a cycle of abuse, and colonization is a cycle of abuse. Humans are a virus. That's not true. And in fact, indigenous people can't represent are, we're less than 5% of the world's population. But if you take a look at any one of the territories around here, for example, you're going to see 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. We have forgotten our original instructions, some of us. Cities are the problem. That's not true. Cities are actually pretty cool, and city folks consume a lot less resources because we don't have to drive all over the place to get our stuff. We can walk, we can take public transportation. The largest carbon emitters are actually things like ag and coal, which are not in cities, they're in rural areas. Urban environmental degradation is the product of historical urban planning policies and segregation, redlining, and capitalism. Immigrants, they're invading the borders. Borders aren't real. Borders are not real. Climate change is a crisis for migrants, not a crisis of migrants. When we're thinking about border invasions, because they're being driven from where they don't want to leave. They don't want to leave their families. They don't want to leave the lands that they call home, their homelands. It's about knowing that borders are a human construction. Environmental and social collapse is the only way. We need to reset. We need to snap our fingers like Thanos. Well, we saw COVID. That was a snap in some ways, and it did nothing but put money in the pockets of billionaires. Our incomes fell, and inflation is now at 13.5%, right? No, sorry, I call BS on that. Indigenous people of color, marginalized grassroots communities, all the folks probably in this room, we are all transforming these social systems together and we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So those are some of the conversations you might have with some of the weird, family members who, uncomfortable combos. But there's a great resource I'll send to Julia that has a really great magazine that you can use that is sort of like a tool you can use. That's a fun way to maybe bring this up at the dinner table. Okay, I'm going to get just a little bit. I want to share about one of the people who I just really respect in this work. His name is Glenn Coulthard, Dene Nation, and he says, and I'm just going to leave you with this, but in this moment, and then get into some good stuff. But he says, for indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die. And when I say indigenous nations, I actually mean the land too, because we are the land. And for capitalism to die, we must actively participate in the construction of indigenous alternatives to it. So some of the things on the side, I just want to make sure that you know, permeable accumulation and capitalism and settler colonialism, especially settler colonialism, it's not dead, it's not gone, it's not in the past. This is something that is happening right now, right here in this very moment. Capitalism needs to self-perpetuate in order to exist, and it works directly against developing indigenous alternatives. And keeping up with the Joneses, right? Like, is capitalism and is settler colonialism and is primitive accumulation, are they the evil empire? Does it look like that all the time? No. It looks like us sitting right here, keeping up with the Joneses, right? Making extraction and capitalist accumulation look normal, not feeling enough, that narrative of scarcity all the time. So, futures. Let's get into some good stuff. So how are we doing this? I'm a Mohawk woman. I'm an indigenous feminist. My pedagogy and my methodology are about doing and creating and co-creating and collaborating. So now that we've touched on some of these myths and we're finding traction within the minds of our environmentally aligned individuals, I want you to take a look at this while I'm talking because it's really rich to explore. Number one, I don't know if people can see it okay with the lights on, but this is a poster that we had Kai Delubio, one of the NEFOC network members, created for our annual report. And it's a really beautiful poster that envisions not just, what we are seeing, but the active kind of struggle, but also this really generative liberatory moment that we're envisioning in the work that we do at Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And you can see kind of in the center that black snake, right? And the sort of crack of thunder that really personifies a lot of what we're talking about right now. So I'm what you call a plant person, and the work that I do is through the magic of plants to nourish, heal, and resist. And I've been lucky enough to find a whole community of plant people, many communities of plant people that I get to work with every day to bring justice and healing to the land and to the human and non-human communities who love the land. Plants are magic, They transform light and water into substances that nourish humans, non-humans, and the land. When we eat, we are embodying the alchemical processes of braided stories hidden in the genomes of seeds, little packets that carry the original instructions of creation to do what they do best, create. Plants are rhythmic beings. They are the dancers to the drummers of creation. They follow the rhythms and cycles of the earth and the rest of the cosmos, sending down roots when the moon is dark and seeds when send up shoots when she's full. Humans and non-humans are, by extension, plants. We dance to the same drums and receive the same nourishment and healing they provide, therefore ensuring that their part of the covenant they've made with creation are maintained. By receiving these gifts from our elder siblings, the plants, we inherit that covenant to nurture and heal as human beings. Our story of human beings is a story of seeds and mycorrhizae, of encoded potential and intergenerational, interdependent relationship. The story of humankind is written in seed song, and the prayers for growth and nourishment, the weeps and wails of grief at the ruins we've created, and the restoring of our relationships while we teeter on the verge of the sixth mass extinction. I'm going to share with you a few ways we're attempting to restore our relationships with land and each other in the response to this looming threat. In order to do this, we are resituating storytellers as story makers, weaving together our place thought of geography, history, and cosmology for the purpose of adapting to and co-creating a new set of inherent roles and responsibilities that restores and restories the land and our relationships with each other. The work that we're doing at the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, Skyworld Apothecary and Farm, Seed Soil and Spirit School, and so many other collectives, grassroots collectives, organizations, just people in community. These things were co-created to address the deep time relationships we have with the land, each other, and the universal truth of our small, young role in creation. We planted these seeds as a direct response, a resistance to the forgetting, the disconnection, and the hierarchy imposed by Western actors, settler colonialism, and the momentary yet intense disruptive harm capitalism's wrought on the land, and by extension, the people and non-human kin of the land. Our collective visions are simple, yet equally complex: to advance sovereignty and cross-cultural healing on Turtle Island and the territories and globally, in the territories of hundreds of sovereign nations, through reconnection, rematriation, reparations, and stewardship of land, seeds, knowledge, and relationships in a sacred manner that honors our ancestors' collective dreams for responsible farming, sustainable human habitat, reintegration of ceremony, restoration of native species ecosystems, climate justice, and global indigenous cultural preservation. We're rematriating land, advancing reparations, building land-based Black Indigenous solidarity collectives, developing collective protocols for multi-species jurisprudence, restoring and restoring ecosystems with native species and traditional ecological knowledge, feeding our people and countering the monoculture of white supremacy with a synergistic intergenerational, mycorrhizal, polycultural community that are dismantling the systems that were never built to serve us or the lands that we're responsible to. We are both and a non-binary evolution of the potential of what land stewardship and cross-cultural restoration are capable of in the Anthropocene. Our work is built and guided by the communities we belong to and are accountable to. The cross-cultural myriad of ancestral relationships we hold like precious embers, weaving our love for kin in each seed we plant, each word we speak, each small patch of earth we re-inoculate with mycorrhizae. As Michelle Obama once stated, when they go low, we go high. When they speak of deals, we speak of relationships. When they affirm ownership, we affirm land care. When they hoard land-based wealth, we redistribute it. When they speak of us in the past tense, we dance until the land remembers us. This collective work is a love letter to our ancestors and future generations, a song quietly sung to the land that we remember. We remember a time when we were all connected, when we were not separate or above, but equal to and responsible for in our short times on this long-lived earth. As our network of ancestrally rooted care continues to extend through the territories, our greatest hope and desire is to spark that remembering in others. We take care of the land, and the land takes care of us. Simple, right? So that's kind of what we're doing, just in a little nutshell, too long, didn't read kind of version. So I want to leave you with something. A lot of this brings up a lot of grief, a lot of shame in myself. You know, there's so many different intersections of what we can feel as a burden in our bodies and our spirits. And these conversations around massacres bring about that intense grief, something we are collectively holding right now. In the spaces I frequent, environmental restoration, land and food access, movement building, climate justice, the main theme right now across the board is grief. It can paralyze us into not acting in any way, shape, or form. And the last thing I want you to do is feel overwhelmed walking out of this space and without any kind of tools for being able to unburden your minds. As a Haudenosaunee woman, as an Oklahoma woman, one of my roles and responsibilities in my community as a Haudenosaunee person is to maintain a good mind or Gonigohio. Not just for myself, but also our responsibilities for all to help everybody maintain their good mind, to come back to that good mind. And grief and trauma really impact our bodies, minds, and spirits in very acute ways, and can really remain in us in a chronic way as well. And we can see that biologically as well as spiritually, emotionally. But how do we step into a collective good mind so we can move into this experience and this time together and ultimately out into the world from anchored from that place of good mind, in a world where each day we're witnessing these irreversible and terrifying things happen? Well, we have a story. Rick Hill was the first person who taught me about this. And it makes sense that we're here in Onondaga territory because Tadadaho was an Onondaga chief who they say he had snakes for hair. I think there's a slide there. So he had snakes for hair and his body was made crooked. And what that's showing you or communicating is that he was broken. He has parts of him that are broken. His mind was broken, his body was broken. He was a broken spirit. And he was taking that out on his people. His people were terrified of him. And he would cannibalize them. He was murderous and people were just in hiding. They were terrified. We have somebody here, and this is the place where much of this happened, where the peacemaker came. And the peacemaker came to work with Tadadaho, and he worked with a radical woman named Chiganasi, who transformed his mind from violence into peace. And they began this process with a song that led to healing. They straightened his body and what they say is combed the snakes from his hair with songs and with ceremony and with a collective community care practice. So this is a central story to our responsibilities as Haudenosaunee people to unburden the minds of others. We use this all the time, and we actually use this as a way to build a conflict transformation process for child welfare systems in Ontario. To use these teachings as a way to not only heal the people who are being harmed, but also the people harming, so that this doesn't happen ever again. I just want to, we're good for time, right? 5 minutes, maybe not even. So just in a nutshell, that was something that this process that Tadadaho's process, his healing brought about within the work of the conflict transformation work we did. There's something called the condolence, and that's something you hear a lot, condolences, right? Like, I'm sorry that you lost somebody, condolences, but what does that actually mean? When you're saying that, you're saying I'm uplifting, I'm trying to uplift the burden of your grief right now. I'm offering you a part of myself. And we do not separate out the harmer and the harmed. We surround everybody with the same care because we are all human beings. We were all babies once, right? So this condolence process is something that we've done for a long, long time. And we did this, it's an intercultural process, actually. It's something that we've done with other nations, with other, folks coming from other villages. We did this with the Canadian government. They would come to the edge of the woods and meet us, and we would do this practice with them. And it's called the Edge of the Woods. And part of that process is It's about them coming to the edge of the woods, lighting a fire, and basically announcing their presence so that we could meet them there and have our healers check them out and make sure that they were healthy, right? They weren't going to bring anything into our village that was going to put our people at risk, in a nutshell. And this is like really distilling this down in ways that I'm probably not doing justice for right now. Rick, when he started doing this process, what he said was, we need to do this edge of the woods with families because they're all holding so much grief. Again, when I was working with Neil Henderson, this whole term, last term, as we're talking from Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, how do we work with environmentalists who are holding so much grief and shame, right? How do we work with people whose generations and generations of ancestors who have also gone through colonization and are broken and crooked with snakes for hair, and who are now out on the streets of Buffalo, New York, and other places, exercising that distress in ways that they cannot name. I don't hate these people. What I see is somebody who needs help, and not just an entire, not just one person, it's an entire group of people who think that they're the global majority. There's something broken in these people, and it's so deep down in their ancestry that they don't see it anymore. It's just the norm now, but it's not the norm. And we know that because we can see the last 500 years, things have dramatically changed. So I'm going to leave you with this process called the edge of the woods and the wiping of the tears as a way to just unburden your grief in this moment. And you can think about this if you ever need it. It's here for you. It's not a hidden ceremony that is never practiced. Rick, people have given us the ability to share this with others because that's what it's meant for. So if you feel comfortable, and no judgment if you don't, but I'm going to invite you to close your eyes because we don't have the things that we need to do this en masse. It's something you can just do inside yourself. So if you want to close your eyes, cool. If you don't, that's cool too. So imagine in your hand, you're holding a soft piece of white deer hide. It comes from a doe from the belly of her body, soft white deer hide, just a little square. And we're going to take that deer hide and just put it to your eyes. There are so many things that could happen. Your eyes are red, and the things that you might have seen on your travels could be troubling you. Let this clear your eyes. We were given a gift to cleanse our spirit with the tears that flow, the tears that are to wash away the hurt we feel. Let's use this soft white deer hide to wipe our eyes, and this is being done now. This is the translation. Now I'm going to ask you to take a look at your hand again, and in your hand is a soft white eagle puff, the little tiny fluffy part of the eagle feather that is right down by the base of the eagle's body. And we're going to work on your ears now. We clean our ears because so many things could happen, and because of the things that we may have heard, because there are many things that might interfere with one's hearing. Let us wipe away anything wicked or disruptive, thereby allowing the person or yourself to hear clearly and directly. We were instructed that when we have a loss in our families, when we're holding grief or we feel deep sorrow, we are unable to listen to each other or the songs of the birds or the health that is around us. We were instructed to take the soft down feathers of an eagle to wipe away the blockage from our ears so that you can hear truth. Finally, in your hands, in your mind, you're holding a glass of cool, fresh spring water. We're going to work on your throat. We're going to wet your throat and hydrate your throat so you can breathe freely and clear your throat because you might be exhausted, and drink it so you can refresh yourself and be comfortable. The throat is the place where our voice comes from. We were instructed that during the deep sorrow, we are unable to speak, unable to sing, and unable to communicate what we are experiencing. We are instructed to take spring water and drink it to cleanse the blockages from our throats so we can speak truth. The misanthropic ideas of ecofascists and their extreme solutions to environmental degradation and overpopulation represent an increasingly prevalent ideological tendency within extreme right subcultures. The violent panacea of genocide, restriction of borders, and control of humans is gaining traction as technology allows for ideological breeding grounds and echo chambers to multiply exponentially. While some ecofascists recognize that capitalism has contributed to our current environmental urgency, they cannot seem to understand that they continue to benefit from it through the systems that capitalism has created to advance settler colonial projects. Ecofascism is the death cult of capitalism. And those who act on their desperation are its martyrs, blinded by fear and hate. We too can be paralyzed by overwhelm, grief, and fear, but we have something they don't. Each other. We've been given tools to unburden our minds, to lift off the grief and fear, allowing us to see, hear, and speak truth that brings us and our families and communities back to our good minds. Where we're collectively headed in the next few years will require us to fully show up despite fear. So in closing, I present you with one offering. This is a poem called I Give You Back by Joy Harjo. I release you, my beautiful and terrible fear. I release you. You were my beloved and hated twin, but now I don't know you as myself. I release you with all the pain I would know at the death of my children. You are not my blood anymore. I give you back to the soldiers who burned down my house, beheaded my children, raped and sodomized my brothers and sisters. I give you back to those who stole the food from our plates when we were starving. I release you, fear, because you hold these scenes in front of me and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you. I release you. I release you. I release you. I am not afraid to be hungry. I'm not afraid to rejoice. I'm not afraid to be Black. I'm not afraid to be white. I'm not afraid to be hungry. I'm not afraid to be full. I'm not afraid to be hated. I'm not afraid to be loved. To be loved. To be loved, fear. Oh, you have choked me, but I gave you the leash. You have gutted me, but I gave you the knife. You have devoured me, but I laid myself across the fire. I take myself back, fear. You are not my shadow any longer. I won't hold you in my hands. You can't live in my eyes, my ears, my voice, my belly, or in my heart. My heart. My heart. But come here, fear. I'm alive. And you are so afraid of dying. Yeah, we're going. Yeah.
I feel like I need to sit for a moment.
Any questions?
On that note,
I don't have to like.
Okay. Yeah, just to log in as soon as let's take audience questions while I try to log into Zoom. Any questions? Appropriate teacher wait time.
I'll share my slides because I have like contact info and stuff there as well.
So I'm kind of struggling with something during all of this. So during the slides, a lot came up about the global 1%, and I definitely acknowledge that is the true source of a lot of evils and dismantling capitalism. But I'm struggling with, sorry, this is like a half-formed idea on like 3 hours of sleep. But yeah, no, I guess something that I'm struggling with is in these trying to enact these processes, I feel like that global 1% is very attached to the current mechanism of things and how, and what does doing this in the face of people with a lot of power who are very dedicated to things not changing, what does that look like to affect change on those communities? Hopefully that makes sense.
This is a great example, this image, right? Sorry. This one isn't like,
I think this one worked.
yeah. I don't know. Okay, there we
Okay.
it's working. So there are a lot of people out there with a lot of money who are redistributing it. Silently, no foundations, no websites, nothing. They're out there and they're working with us. And I'm not talking like tens of thousands of dollars. They recognize where their wealth comes from and that it's continuously being generated and will not go away. And they are redistributing that wealth every single quarter. That wealth is going to continue to generate as long as the capitalist project is alive. You know, I can't name anybody specifically, but we have in this movement, not enough of them, but they're leading the way and not only building capacity within these movements in ways that I never even imagined was possible, but they're also securing land from development. They're doing everything that they can right now to get the word out to their colleagues, family members, and other folks who are in that 1%. We haven't been thinking about this, right? They're in their own echo chamber too, right? In Beverly Hills Housewives or whatever. So I think if we watch over the next few years, you're going to see some radical shifts in the way that people are redistributing their wealth. That's one way I can think of it.
I'll talk I'm gonna have a less altruistic way of redistributing wealth, right? So Matt Huber, who's a faculty member here at the Maxwell School, has a book that just came out called he's at Maxwell Geography, right? It's called Climate Change as Class War. And he talks about the role of kind of unions and worker movements as mechanisms for redistributing power and wealth. And so I think the altruistic part of it is certainly honorable, right? But like there's also a part of that kind of altruism that's fundamentally undemocratic. And so I think it's always a question of like tactics and strategies, right? And I think if you work on climate change stuff long enough, you will find that like there actually are amazing people out there doing really amazing things at all kinds of scales. And I think that's like put your energy into like those different scales. This isn't the kind of thing that you're going to like individualize your way out of, right? Use a different straw pool. Like, that's not going to move Goldman Sachs, right? Like, so a lot of the work is going on as well. So I was just in a meeting the other day with people who are going to the new COP meeting, COP27 in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And there's increasingly a conversation around, what is it called? Loss transfers, essentially reparations. That you have, this is where these kind of global climate change meetings always break down, where you have the kind of like global north refusing to redistribute any of that privilege or power to places that are that have been colonized, that have been subjugated, right? And I think that kind of justice movement within the climate negotiations is where some of this is happening. So now you're talking about people at the level of government redistributing wealth to populations that have least caused climate change, but most suffer. This was a big issue in the most recent bill. We finally have climate change legislation in this country under the Democrats and Biden, but it doesn't really get into these power inequities and in some ways actually furthers them, right? So green colonialism is something that we should all be thinking about as well, right? Like the lithium to produce all these batteries is only in a couple of places in the world, right? Rural Idaho, Bolivia, lithium triangle. Like a lot of people in sustainability, environmental stuff don't like to talk about that. It's still a kind of colonialism.
And
So
it's happening in our backyards.
yeah.
Right now, Seneca Tonawanda Reservation, which is maybe 2 hours from here, there's a green hydrogen plant proposed that they've already broken ground on next to Oak Grove Forest. Of course, it's like clear-cut environmental racism. I mean, it's right next to the reserve. They could have put it anywhere, but it's a red area in New York State. It's a Republican area, and the only way that people can get votes is to create jobs, right? And to hide behind that green label. But it's a green hydrogen plant. It's gonna have one truck every 15 minutes trucking things back out. It's going to create, it's the nail in the coffin, right? Policy is another, it's another part that I would say, if, like at UFOC, for example, we have we're developing a policy platform because we haven't been around that long to be able to have built one earlier, but inclusion of our voices in policy is really essential. And very often is a checkbox, right? It's very, very much a process and a transaction. It's obligatory instead of wholesome and robust inclusion of our minds and our values.
Probably way more to say about that.
Yeah, it's a whole other lecture in and of itself.
I think we have time for one more question because I know we had said.
Thank you both so much. My question is about land acknowledgements and land atonement. What is your sense of who ought to say what as we continue to make space, acknowledge, and learn? And what is the best way to cite and credit Rick Hill around this question of land atonement?
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
So we have a very small kind of First Nations group on our campus that was started this year. They asked me to be the advisor. And when I was talking to these students, and I think some of them tuned in tonight, we were having this conversation around land acknowledgements, and they were just kind of like, meh, like they don't. It's a kind of like, okay, now what? Like, what about access to land? And what about like scholarships? And what about like tangible material things? And so I think I'm ambivalent on them. I think they, and I mean that in the sense of ambivalent. I think it on the one hand makes people aware of some of these relationships, but oftentimes I think that's where it stops. And I was at an ARA meeting in San Diego, and like the 5th land acknowledgement at a professional conference, I was like, what are we doing here? Like, what are we doing? So the question for me is always like, what comes after that? And like materially, and I think like Syracuse has scholarships for Haudenosaunee students, and like actually has Center for Native People. Like there's a lot that you can do beyond land acknowledgements. I think there's a performativity to them. People almost a kind of like almost like a religious cleansing practice, right? Like, like you've absolved yourself some sort of thing. But like, you know, on the other hand, many of my students, like they didn't learn the history of Southern colonialism because of white supremacists in my school curriculum. We're still fighting this battle over school curriculum in this country, right? So when you get into that, they're like, oh, what are the implications of that? So it's not all bad. Yeah.
Well, I agree. I also feel ambivalent in that. I will say that I worked with Hayden King, who was the person when I worked at McMaster University, who came up with the first land acknowledgement for Ryerson ever, and it was for Ryerson University, I think, at that point. And he did it, and then felt like he wanted to retract because it just felt so transactional and performative. That being said, CNPE created their own land acknowledgement, and they were like, are they going to even accept it, right? Like, are they going to, they were so happy and proud when that happened. When I went over the border, you know, my people are on both sides of this border. I rolled up to that border and I always feel very conspicuous, and like people are going to be, you know, I just always feel that way when I hit the border. And the woman said, hello. They always say hello, bonjour. They always say that when you hit the border. This time they said, hello, bonjour, sego. And even though it's a border and I should not have to stop at the stupid kiosk and like get the pat down or whatever, I felt emotionally shaken and moved that they're making an effort in some ways. So part of it, I think, is just, I would much rather hear a land acknowledgement than the Pledge of Allegiance. right? In the morning, I saw my sister post my nieces doing the Pledge of Allegiance, and she was saying, I'm so proud. It was such a strange moment for me to see an Oklahoma woman say that. It was so disconcerting and just, anyway, so yeah, as far as the who should do it and when and how and where, there are a lot of thoughts about that. I'm one person, you're one person. I think it's about checking in with yourself, knowing that there are many options, and that if you're going to speak out a land acknowledgement, it's not just about saying I'm here on stolen land, but I'm here on stolen land and this is what I'm doing about it.
Okay, thank you very much. It's close to our time, 6:30. Please, we had hoped they would be here earlier, but please help yourselves to little snacks in the back. Please help yourselves. I hope my students have brought bags to take stuff home with them. Thank you so much for this. I appreciate your coming, and thank you, Joe and Stephanie.